This lecture will be on public opinion and foreign policy. In your book, Jonathan talks a lot about the ways in which public opinion influences foreign policy. So I won't talk about that much in this lecture. Mostly, I'm going to talk about the ways in which people have thought about how the public forms foreign policy beliefs and attitudes. And at the end, we'll talk about a theory of how the public influences foreign policy that Jonathan doesn't talk too much about. So, let's talk about explanations for public views on foreign policy. So, the initial view that started when people started looking systematically at understanding public attitudes, particularly American public attitudes towards policies, was that the American public was uninformed and foolish in regards to foreign policy. That is, people who studied this argued that for domestic politics, for local and national politics, people had better knowledge than foreign policy, and they had a more consistent way of thinking about about their attitudes towards particular policies. So to give you an example, early writers on this, for example, focused on the way in which partisanship or partisan identification structured people's attitudes towards different policies. And so they argued that while that worked well in domestic policy, they argued in foreign policy there didn't appear to be any similar type of mechanism structuring people's attitudes about foreign policy. As a result, they called people essentially uninformed and foolish about foreign policy. So what they meant by this was, first, that they argued that most Americans, in terms of an understanding of the world, that is, information about politics, their information was primarily about local or national politics, and they had very little knowledge about world politics or American foreign policy. So, to give you an example, for example, the current events questions on the tests, they argued when the surveys, they would ask people these types of questions, and most people would only get maybe one or two of those questions right. And so essentially they argue that most Americans don't know much about what's going on in the rest of the world, who other world leaders are, and sometimes they weren't sure who sort of important foreign policy actors were in American foreign policy. The second part of this is that they argued that people's attitudes towards policies were what they called volatile and random. And so let's start with the random part. What essentially they mean by this is that there did not appear to be a structured way in which people made decisions about foreign policy. It appeared to be that a person's opinion or attitude about a particular foreign policy appeared to be random. As if you looked at one person and you looked at their attitudes about 2 or 3 different foreign policy issues, there didn't appear to be any clear connection. There didn't appear to be a pattern emerging about how people think about foreign policy, hence they termed it random. The second part of this is that it was volatile. Essentially what they meant by this was that while people's policies were random across different issues, for any individual issue, it could be very volatile. That is, it could change rapidly based on any number of things. And so they essentially argued that people had volatile and random views and attitudes about particular policies. Now, the last part of this was they argued this applies only to the public or the masses and not the elites. They argued American leaders, they had knowledge about foreign policy, they had structured beliefs, but the public, conversely, didn't have the same type of approach. So these early writers essentially argued the effect of a public that was uninformed and foolish was either that they had no effect on foreign policy, that is, that the government essentially ignored them because they didn't really know what they were talking about, or that the public actually was hurting American foreign policy, that is, because they were making decisions based on a lack of information and were making decisions sort of that were random and sort of very volatile, that if government leaders were actually trying to follow public opinion as a basis for decision making, then they themselves are making volatile and random policies. And you see people like Morgenthau, for example, provide critiques of this. That is, he has this famous quote where he calls American foreign policy like a dinosaur. He says it's very slow to move, but when it does, it destroys everything in its path. And essentially, he was sort of arguing that it's hard to mobilize popular support for particular foreign policy issues, but when it's mobilized, it's hard to sort of slow it down. It sort of leads to a call for absolute foreign policies. After this initial viewpoint, many people began to challenge this notion of this sort of uninformed and foolish public about foreign policy. And so the first thing that these people argued is that people did lack specific information, that across surveys, people just couldn't really answer questions about current events in foreign policy, about actors in foreign policy, etc. But they argued this lack of specific information didn't mean that they were foolish in terms of making foreign policy choices or expressing what their foreign policy opinions were within an issue and across an issue. So what they argued were that foreign policy opinions were structured and not random and volatile, even though people were making these decisions based on a limited set of information. And so what they were really talking about was that people essentially used a structure to organize their foreign policy ideas, and such that when they were exposed to new information, they would incorporate that information into their structure and generate a stable and structured opinion about foreign policy based on whatever mechanism they were using to formulate policy opinions. So, for example, some people argued that just like in domestic politics, people use partisan identification or cues from partisan elites as a basis for making their foreign policy decisions. That is, they may not know a lot about foreign policy, but when, say, a foreign policy crisis arose, they would sort of look to what their partisan elites were saying, and they would use that as a basis of their foreign policy opinion. Right? Other people, again, so some people sort of said, look, the same ways in which people make decisions about domestic politics is the same way people make decisions about foreign policy. Others argued that foreign policy decision-making and the structures people used were unique to foreign policy. And that is, and so this leads to a couple of points we'll talk about. So the first approach is based on U.S. involvement, and in particular, how the U.S. should be involved. And so most of these early scholars essentially said, if you look at people's policies and attitudes about particular foreign policies, they sort of cluster around two different dimensions. The first is cooperative internationalism, and the second is militant internationalism. Cooperative internationalism essentially is a person's view on the degree to which the U.S. should be engaged cooperatively in the world, or in particular how that the U.S. should be engaged with international organizations. The U.S. should take a multilateral approach to dealing with world problems, etc. Militant internationalism was the degree to which people believe the U.S. should use force for its interests abroad. And so here is the degree to which people support, using, essentially, as it sounds, using military force abroad. And so they argued you could use these two dimensions to create a classification of ideal types. Now, one caveat is these four types are ideal types, as they essentially argued that most people mirror one of these four types, but may not be perfectly within. That is, this militant and cooperative nationalism scales are continuous. That is, you aren't just militant internationalists or not militant internationalists. They're degrees, right? Same with cooperative nationalism. But they argue degree to which you lean more towards, favoring or not favoring militant or cooperative nationalism puts you closer to one of these four ideal types. So briefly, let's go over the four ideal types. The first one is internationalist, and these are people who support both the use of force abroad as well as using cooperation or international organizations or multilateral groups to resolve foreign policy issues. These people essentially are called internationalists because they approve of using all foreign policy tools to interact with the world. You can contrast this with hardliners, those who support the use of force abroad, but essentially oppose cooperative internationalism. And so people who study this essentially argue the difference between hardliners and internationalists is that hardliners tend to view cooperation, international organizations, or multilateral groupings as ineffective in dealing with world problems. That is, while they approve of the use of U.S. force to support American interests, they tend to view with suspicion multilateral organizations in particular. Again, you can compare both of these to what are called accommodationists, those who support cooperative nationalism but oppose militant internationalism. Essentially, these people tend to view the use of force as jeopardizing American interests. So while they support the U.S. acting abroad in a cooperative fashion through organizations, etc., they view the use of force as detrimental to achieving American foreign policy goals, either by creating levels of anti-Americanism or by sort of wasting resources that could be used towards more productive international policies. And the final category are isolationists, those who oppose any form of international interaction, either through force or through cooperation. These people tend to view security for the U.S. as being best if the U.S. stays out of world affairs. This is sort of this traditional Adams policy that you read about in sort of avoiding monsters to destroy. These people tend to view sort of the use of force as generating anti-American support. They tend to view sort of cooperation abroad as sort of entrapping U.S. policies, limiting U.S. freedoms, and so they favor essentially avoiding interacting either cooperatively or through force abroad. So from this structured and stable point of view, these proponents essentially argued, like Jentleson does, that the public can affect foreign policy and can affect it in a positive way, in the sense that people with structured and stable opinions can guide American foreign policy in a way that's not sort of dangerous, and in a way that sort of suits what the American people want themselves, right? And so the conclusion from these people who make this structured and stable argument is that public opinion not only can, but it should be able to influence foreign policy, given that it's guided upon certain beliefs and principles that essentially mirror debates similar within the American elite itself. Another approach besides this sort of cooperative versus militant internationalism is what is often termed the public mood. Here, essentially, people argue that foreign policy opinions fit a broader political view that constrains the government. And so this mood can be sort of composed of essentially people's views about the role of government, in other words, how necessary or how good is government, as well as their trust in government. And so the important part of this for these proponents is that the public mood will set the bound upon which policies are evaluated, but doesn't necessarily determine, and for any particular policy, what the people will support. That is, it sort of sets bounds on what people are willing to support, but does not determine specifically what the actual policy is likely to be. So, let's start with identifying some of the moods these scholars have talked about. The first one the second part of this is they talk about how the mood changes. That is, they suggest that the public mood can be affected by both government policy and external events. Essentially, they argue that the public mood will shift based on either government policy or external events that highlight the need for greater government involvement, or highlight sort of the potential threat the government poses to individuals. So, what are some of these public moods? The first one identified is the Cold War mood or Cold War consensus. Now, one reason these moods start with the Cold War is these are all identified sort of using data on public opinion. We don't really have sort of this long-term stable public opinion data until sort of after World War II. So the first one they start off with is this sort of Cold War mood, which essentially is Jentleson's sort of Cold War consensus argument. That is, this is marked by people who are sort of have high trust in government and tend to sort of support broad government policy, again, as a way of securing the United States from the Soviet threat. The second mood is the Vietnam syndrome, and here essentially this is caused by both American involvement in Vietnam as well as the Watergate scandal. And sort of this is characterized by American sort of retrenching from world affairs. As we talked about before, after Vietnam, public opinion polls showed that only 50% of Americans would be willing to defend Canada if invaded militarily. That is, no other American ally received more than 50% support for invasion from a foreign power. Okay, and so here again, the focus is on the aspect of this mood is driven by high distrust of government, particularly driven by Watergate, as well as the belief that government actions don't necessarily produce positive outcomes. Again, this sort of view that government policy in Vietnam was sort of very costly and very divisive. The next mood is the self-interested mood. Most of these scholars contend this is driven by external events, particularly the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the taking of American hostages in Iran. And they sort of argue these external events trigger a need to rely on government despite potentially mistrusting government. So here they essentially argue the self-interested mood is where people start to view government as necessary for promoting their self-interests, right, as providing security against global threats. And so here, people begin to support increased military spending and defending our allies again. Again, this is sort of the difference between this and sort of the Cold War consensus is more based on people's belief in the need for government to protect them as opposed to sort of having high trust in government itself. The second is a sort of pragmatic internationalism. That is, the extent to which global leaders. So here, the event that triggers this for these proponents is the end of the Cold War. Right, at the end of the Cold War, the removal of the Soviet threat shifted a view about what the goal of the government was. That is, the U.S. government was no longer needed to defend against a Soviet threat, but was now seen as promoting pragmatic goals through foreign policy, particularly promoting, for example, American prosperity, using foreign policy to sort of help the American economy, etc. And finally, many have argued after September 11th, the sort of visceral attack on the American homeland prompted an anti-terrorist mood. Again, they argue similar to the Cold War consensus in the sense that people's trust in government rapidly increased, and people began to view the government as necessary to dealing with all kinds of external threats. And so people were willing to sort of accept higher government intervention or higher government actions because they viewed it not only as necessary for their security, but they began to trust the government to sort of provide better goods given a more threatening international environment. Now, there are some who've speculated about a post-Iraq mood, but again, this work is fairly new given how relatively recent the second Gulf War has been. So there's been some speculation about this, but given that most of this work is very preliminary, we won't talk too much about it. All right, so the that emerges from this research is that Americans generally are not too informed on the specifics of foreign policy, as they can't really identify foreign heads of state. They oftentimes are not really aware of what organizations the U.S. belongs to, are not often aware of the exact policies the U.S. is pursuing or the goals of current U.S. foreign policy, but they do have coherent and structured beliefs that drive their positions on particular foreign policy issues, and that because these beliefs drive these issues, that those opinions are coherent and they're structured, and so as a result, people can influence government because they have similar beliefs that mirror the type of debates that occur at the elite level. All right. So Jentleson sort of builds upon this by talking then about how specifically public opinion influences foreign policy. So there is another way that Jentleson doesn't talk about the way in which public opinion influences foreign policy, and that's sort of this diversionary theory, also known as Wag the Dog, the movie you'll watch next week, and the rally around the flag effect. And the basic idea behind this theory is that leaders will use foreign policy actions to divert attention from domestic problems. So if a leader's domestic political popularity is dropping, either because the economy is poor or they have some kind of scandal, the leader will use foreign policy, in particular the use of force, to divert public attention away from these problems. And so this is sort of, Wag the Dog sort of fictionalizes this in a more farcical way, but it's sort of the logic behind this. So there's several sort of key assumptions that underlie this theory. The first, and perhaps least controversial, is that presidents or leaders want to stay in power. That is, presidents either want to gain a second term, or they want to ensure their party continues to control the presidency after them. The second assumption, again not very controversial, is that presidents or leaders are dependent on some group to stay in power. That is, presidents need, in theory, sort of 51% of the voting population to stay in power. Again, this is mediated by the Electoral College, which has produced some relatively scandalous, some results that maybe don't mirror the popular vote directly. But the general idea here is that leaders need the support from the populace to maintain their power. Now, the third one, which needs more discussion, is that foreign policy actions, in particular the use of force, can increase a leader's popularity. Right? And so this is the one that we're going to talk a little bit more about in greater detail. So one explanation for this approach is called the in-group, out-group effect, often referred to as the rally around the flag effect. The origins of this theory lie in sort of psychology, where people argued in small group settings. People within a group tended to become more cohesive when faced with a competing group. That is, in a small group setting, people tended to when faced with an external group, tended to put aside sort of differences the group may have and tend to become more cohesive in the face of this new group. And if this new group disappeared, the cohesion tended to decrease. Now, people have tried to sort of generalize this in-group, out-group effect to the U.S., or states, very large groups, and they sort of argue that in the U.S. in particular, when faced with foreign threats, people sort of rally around the flag, right? They put aside their differences and sort of support the U.S. against a foreign threat. And so this is sort of the logic of that third assumption, that when faced with conflictual situations, people will rally behind the U.S., in particular rally behind the president. Another approach essentially argues that presidents can demonstrate competency by using foreign policy. That is, when a president faces waning popularity because of domestic problems, they may be perceived as not competent, for example, say in handling the economy. But they can compensate for that perceived lack of economic skill by demonstrating sort of better skill in handling foreign policy matters. That is, if they can sort of engage in conflict and be successful, they can demonstrate that they're competent in terms of foreign policy and demonstrate that perhaps their leadership skills are best in foreign policy as opposed to domestic policy. So when a leader faces sort of domestic problems, they can use foreign policy to generate this competency and to sort of convince the electorate to maintain them because of their foreign policy expertise. Now, you pointed to examples of this. So, for example, people often argue that during the Monica Lewinsky hearings involving President Clinton, that when the U.S. attacked parts of Afghanistan, or dropped essentially bombs on parts of Afghanistan and Sudan, the timing of that was to divert attention away from the Lewinsky scandals. Similarly, in the editorial that you will read, one author argues that the second war in Iraq was essentially a diversion from a potentially faltering economy, right? And so, in addition, people have sort of argued, if you look at wars, for example, after the start of the first Gulf War, after the start of the Afghanistan War, you did sort of see these sort of spikes in approval for the president. Now, there are those who criticize this approach, and they essentially sort of point out a couple of problems. One is they argue that the rally effect is very short. In other words, they argue that that the temporary boost in popularity is very short-lived. It may only last a month or two. And that two, over the long term, right, if a war lasts long enough, it starts to hurt presidential opinion. Right? You can take the case of the Second Gulf War, where initially Bush's popularity rose after the start of the Second Gulf War, but the longer that war lasted, right, the more Bush's approval ratings fell and fell. And so by the time he left office, he sort of had historically low presidential approval ratings. And so similarly, you can look at Bush Sr., right, Bush's father, who won the first Gulf War and had, as I said, had sort of 90% approval ratings after the war, but ultimately lost the 1992 election. Second, many argue there's no systematic empirical evidence. That is, well, you can point to examples where it seems like there was domestic scandal and a president used force, that systematically it doesn't appear that when presidents consistently face domestic political popularity problems, that they turn to force. And there's the other side of this. That is, well, low popularity doesn't always mean force. We often see force not preceded by domestic problems. That is, for example, force is often initiated when presidents have high levels of popularity. And so they argue that there are other reasons by which presidents may use force, and the opportunity to use force may not arise when presidents have low popularity as well. And finally, some argue from a normative perspective that this theory just doesn't make sense. And essentially argue that a president, for normative reasons or for sort of ethical reasons, would not use force for personal gain. In other words, they wouldn't use force, they wouldn't jeopardize the lives of American soldiers for simply their own personal gain of increasing their popularity by a few points. That is, they wouldn't sort of seek a 10% increase in their popularity by jeopardizing the lives of American soldiers. And so they sort of argue that while this theory makes some sense, that the prohibition against sort of jeopardizing the lives of soldiers for personal gain sort of in many ways, they argue, invalidates the logic of this approach.